Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is all about the Suez Canal. It's been in the news, probably not recently by the time this video comes out, but it was blocked for a while. Now it's not, so now seems like a good time for a video about that. Some mega projects have redefined a country, some led to greater innovation within a specific industry, but a few generate change on a truly global level. What we're talking about today redefined global trade and travel. It's not surprising that 161 years after construction first began, it has perhaps lost a little bit of its shine, especially when compared to the bold, brash achievements of the 21st century. But make no mistake about it, this grey-haired, grizzled mega project absolutely changed the world. The Suez Canal, which opened in 1869, linked the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea for the first time. But perhaps more importantly, it therefore linked the Atlantic with the Indian Ocean. This was an absolute game changer in terms of an east-west connection. Before the canal, a journey by ship from London to Mumbai clocked in at 10,720 miles, but the completion of the Suez Canal meant they went down to 6,260 miles, shaving a handy 23 to 26 days off the total journey. This 120-mile man-made slither of water from Port Said in the north to Suez in the south fundamentally changed the way we moved around the world long before airplanes could jet us across the planet in a matter of hours. In fact, long before airplanes were even made. It's wild that this was done in the 19th century. While it would be a stretch to call the Suez Canal a modern project, it certainly was in comparison to the earliest recorded canals in ancient Egypt. As early as 2000 BC, rudimentary channels connecting the River Nile and the Red Sea were already in operation. However, they were almost entirely lost to both time and the encroaching desert. It wasn't until Napoleon Bonaparte ordered an in-depth survey of the area in 1798 and the publication of Description de l'Egypte that details of these ancient waterways appeared once again. They were, of course, much smaller and simpler than what we have today, but they were still an extraordinary achievement for the ancient world. The French emperor initially showed a keen interest in the construction of a canal, but these ideas were abandoned when engineers concluded that the canal would need locks because of elevation difference, a conclusion that turned out, in the end, to be completely wrong. During the 1830s and 1840s, these doubts were finally disproven, and with trade between East and West booming, it seemed only a matter of time until a project was given the go-ahead. Both the British and the French were major players in the area at the time, but the prospect of a canal interested the French far more than the British, who chose to focus on their Alexandria to Suez railway line. And so enters into the story Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat who became the driving force of the entire project. In 1854, he was granted a concession by Said Pasha, the Khedive, the ruler of Egypt and Sudan, to form a company and construct the canal. He also convened a group wonderfully named the International Commission for Piercing the Isthmus of Suez, in which 13 experts from 7 different countries collaborated to form plans for the canal. On the 15th of May, 1858, the Suez Canal Company was born, owned by both France and Egypt. Construction began in Port Said on the 25th of April 1859 and took 10 years to complete. In terms of what we're used to in the 21st century, the working conditions were absolutely barbaric. Until 1864, forced labor was commonly used, with as many as 120,000 workers dying throughout the construction process, many from disease, particularly cholera. The British, conveniently forgetting that they had used forced labor in the construction of the Alexandria-Suez Railway a few years before, objected fiercely to the working conditions, even going as far as to stir up an armed Bedouin revolt. Eventually, things calmed down, and the Khedive decreed that forced labor would cease immediately. If you're thinking that the British suddenly developed a conscience, well, I'll just stop you right there. It was all about business. The British knew that a canal would affect trade along their railway and maybe even challenge their position as the leading naval power of the time. I think this surprises no one. It's not suddenly, oh yeah, the nation got a conscience in the 19th century about forced labor. Just doesn't sound right, does it? An estimated 1.5 million people worked on the canal at some point throughout the decade, with around 30,000 working at any one time. Much of the early work was done by hand with simple picks and shovels, but after forced labor was done away with, engineers were forced to invest in the most state-of-the-art machinery of the time. These steam-powered shovels proved incredibly efficient, and the project built up considerable speed. Of the 75 million cubic meters of sand removed, 3/4 was done by heavy machinery. On completion, the canal was 7.6 meters deep, 22 meters wide at the bottom, and 60 to 90 meters wide on the surface, which is actually smaller than it is today, which we'll be getting to shortly. It also came out twice over budget at $100 million. Reasonable until you account for inflation, which brings it up to $1.9 billion today, which, considering what it does for global trade, still fairly reasonable. Although I suppose maybe the forced labor made it cheaper, which, yeah, that's not good. A lavish opening ceremony for the canal began on the 15th of November 1869, attended by royalty and dignitaries from around the world. And this went on for 48 hours and included prayers, blessings, speeches, and considering the French were heavily involved, one would imagine plenty of food and excellent wine. The first ships to enter the canal did so on the 17th of November, but it's fair to say that the first day didn't entirely go to plan. The French ship Pelouse managed to ground itself in Lake Timsar, around 41 miles south of Port Said, resulting in a blockage that stretched back into the canal itself. Appropriate considering the recent problems. The ship needed to be pulled out the following morning and led some at the time to question whether the canal was as deep as claimed. But there was another intriguing tale that occurred that day. Confusion remains as to which ship entered the canal first. Official versions state that it was the French ship Aigle, however, this is disputed. Another story goes that one particularly sneaky British captain, George Nares, ordered his ship, HMS Newport, to jump the queue under the cover of darkness. The crew of the Aigle were said to have woken to find the British ship now in front of them. If only we could have recorded the looks on the French faces as they emerged from their bunks, no doubt a little groggy from all the festivities, to find a Union Jack fluttering ahead of them. George Nares was officially reprimanded for his most ungentlemanly behavior, but was secretly lauded for the sheer audacity of it all. The British always enjoyed antagonizing the French whenever possible, and affection that was usually returned. Initial shipping numbers in the first few years were lower than anticipated and led to a rethink in how a ship was taxed to pass through the canal. The Moorsom system, devised by the British in 1849, focused on the hypothetical tonnage of the entire ship, but a new system that instead looked at net tonnage was devised and is still actually in operation today. Interestingly, one proposed element of the canal that didn't make it was an idea put forth by French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. His vision of an enormous statue at the entry to the canal at Port Said, a tribute to the Colossus of Rhodes, was eventually rejected by Ferdinand de Lesseps. I mean, really, who wants to see an enormous statue of a woman dressed in robes, holding a giant flaming torch? And yes, that's absolutely right, what was first designed as a project called Egypt Bringing Light to Asia went on to become the Statue of Liberty. Despite a slow start, the canal had a huge impact on trade around the world. Combined with the Intercontinental Railroad completed in the US 6 months earlier, it was now possible to circumnavigate the globe at speeds that would have been unimaginable a few years before. Goods could be distributed at a faster rate than ever and led to a huge increase in both supply and demand. The effect of this was a huge expansion of national economies, and it considerably sped up the process of globalization. In 1875, the French still retained a majority stake in the canal, with the ruler of Egypt, then Ismail Pasha, holding a 44% stake. However, the ruler was in financial difficulties and they were forced to sell. The British, having seemingly overcome their initial reluctance, were all too glad to offer him £4 million, about £450 million today, for his shares in the company. Less than 10 years later, the British moved to quell local unrest by invading Egypt and seizing control of the canal with the support of the French. In terms of the control of the canal, this was a situation that remained more or less the same for the next 70 years. Located close to one of the most combustible areas on the planet, the Suez Canal has seen its fair share of conflict. From the early disagreements between the Egyptians and the Turks in 1864, all the way through to the Egyptian war with Israel of 1973, the Suez Canal has had a turbulent history. But most famously was the Suez Crisis of 1956. By this point, 2/3 of Europe's oil was passing through the canal. It had become vital to global shipping and was bringing in sizable profits for its shareholders. But this was a delicate time in global politics when countries around the world were often forced to choose between the Western democratic ideology and the communist doctrine emerging out of the Soviet Union. Most, for better or worse, picked a side, but Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's second president, openly courted both, which annoyed, well, just about everybody involved, as you can imagine. However, more significantly, after Britain and the US had withdrawn their support for the construction of the Aswan Dam, Nasser moved quickly to nationalize the Suez Canal, effectively seizing control of it. Not only was this seen as a viable way for them to pay for the dam, but it also responded to the growing public resentment in Egypt about Britain and France's colonial attitudes. If you remember, the original agreement for the canal was a lease of 99 years, and at this point, it was still 13 years short. So, any guesses on what happens next? Under the very shadowy pretext of protecting overseas interests, Britain, France, and Israel waded into conflict with Egypt. Though the military objectives to secure the canal were achieved quickly, it was rendered useless because the Egyptians had blocked the canal before their defeat. And this created what may be the world's most pointless war. Fighting stopped after just 9 days, while growing international pressure led to the British and French scampering home, tails firmly between their legs less than 2 months later. The Israelis retained control of the Sinai Desert for an additional 3 months before also withdrawing. The result was humiliation for the British and the French, with many arguing that, for the British at least, this ended their role as a global superpower. This also led to the deployment of the first UN peacekeeping force to the canal. While the crisis tends to dominate the Suez Canal's history, the strangest set of events were still to come. On June 5, 1967, war broke out once again, with Israel attacking Egypt and quickly drawing both Jordan and Syria into the conflict. Israeli forces overwhelmed the Egyptians and thundered across the Sinai Desert, where they eventually came to a stop on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. The Six-Day War ended after, well, you guessed it, 6 days, and while the Israeli forces never crossed the canal, it had effectively become the front line, with the Israelis on the eastern bank and the Egyptians on the west. By this point, Egypt had already blockaded the canal, preventing any ships from passing through. This was done by scuttling ships and laying mines at both entrances. But unfortunately for them, 15 ships were heading northbound in the canal when fighting broke out, and as escape routes became blocked, these ships had no choice but to set anchor and wait. And they waited for 8 years. Though their crews were rotated on and off the boats every 3 months, the 15 ships themselves remained stranded in the canal until 1975. They famously became known as the Yellow Fleet after a thick sand that seemed to forever cake the ships. But they certainly made the best of it, forming a community between the boats and even holding sporting events. By 1975, when they were authorized to leave, only 2 of the 15 ships remained seaworthy and capable of returning home on their own power. The most significant addition to the canal began on the 15th of August 2014, and it was known as the New Suez Canal. This is perhaps a little misleading because it wasn't a new canal, but rather an extension to the old, combined with a widening and deepening of the original. Over the course of a year, 22 miles of canal was dug parallel to the existing waterway and connected to it, with an additional 23-mile section of the original canal deepened and widened, allowing for two-way shipping along most of the canal for the first time. At a cost of $30 billion, it certainly did not come cheap, but the Egyptian government estimates that it will increase the yearly revenue from $5 billion to $12.5 billion, so it would effectively be paid for in just 4 years, theoretically. Canal capacity has increased from 49 to 97 ships per day, while also reducing waiting times from 11 hours to just 3 hours for most ships. Currently, the canal is 120.11 miles long, 24 meters deep, and 205 meters wide, and is composed of a northern access channel of 14 miles, the canal itself of 100.82 miles, and the southern access channel, which is 5.6 miles. The canal is big enough for most types of nautical shipping, though in some extreme cases, the largest ships need to unload part of their cargo onto smaller ships before making their way through. The canal can support vessels up to 20 meters draft, or 240,000 deadweight tons, and up to a height of 68 meters above water level and a maximum beam of 77.5 meters, which is its widest point. The journey takes between 11 and 16 hours at a speed of around 8 knots. That's about 9 miles per hour or 15 kilometers per hour, and it must be completed in ship convoys set at regulated times over 24 hours. With the addition of the extension canal, you might think that the future looks rather bright for this historic project, and indeed, with the additional revenue and shipping at an all-time high, it probably is for the time being. However, things aren't quite so black and white. In 2015, 115 ships chose to make the original trip around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa rather than go through the Canal. Sounds like madness, right? Well, yeah, in terms of time, it makes absolutely no sense, but financially, it actually does work. A typical oil tanker pays in the region of $465,000 to pass through the canal, but astonishingly, despite being nearly 5,500 miles further, ships can make a tidy saving of $235,000 by taking the longer trip. This becomes considerably more attractive because of what they're often carrying: oil. The price of oil has seen dramatic fluctuation over the last decade and has led to some bizarre stories of oil tankers being ordered to move slowly with the hope that prices may increase, or so sellers might be able to find different buyers. The mad race to market is no longer there. Yes, 115 is a mere dent in the 17,000 ships that passed through the canal in 2015, but with oil prices now hitting record lows, the future may not be as rosy as once thought. What's more, because of climate change, ships are finding it easier and easier to use a northern route which passes above Russia. In 2009, Beluga Group claimed to have completed the sea route from Ulsan in South Korea to Rotterdam in the Netherlands without the assistance of icebreakers. By not using the canal, they had reduced the distance by 4,000 nautical miles. The Suez Canal connected the world like never before, but as our world evolves and our priorities change, it's unclear just how important the canal will be in the future. But for now at least, what began 161 years ago with thousands toiling away with picks and shovels under a fierce Egyptian sun remains a vital commercial lifeline for the world. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, Suez has been a popular topic in the news this year, of recording 2021, because of the ship that got stuck in it a few months ago. And if you're looking for fascinating videos about important topics that are often newsworthy, please make sure you check out my newest channel, Explored, which features everything from democracy in North Korea to genetic editing with CRISPR to the CIA manipulating Hollywood for subtle propaganda. It's fascinating stuff. I hope you'll check it out. There is a link below, and thank you for watching.